important. All right, hello, welcome everybody. I know we'll be joined by more folks as we continue, but thank you all for being here. I am Dr. Danielle Rosevalley. I'm a clinical assistant professor of theater at the University of Buffalo. And today I'm joined by my RA, Ian Downs, who's going to be handling some of the back-end support that makes this event go. So thanks for being here, Ian. A couple of thank yous to issue before I introduce our panelists here. Thank you to the University of Buffalo Department of Theater and Dance for hosting this event. Thank you also to Cooper & Cooper Real Estate for the donation of space and equipment for one of our remote panelists. David is zooming in with us from One Penn Plaza, courtesy of a micro grant that allowed us to get space there. Just some housekeeping things. We're going to be using the QA feature of Zoom webinar. So if you have a question, please click into QA, which should be at the bottom of your screen, and then type it into the question so that it can be seen during QA time. The questions will be passed along to the moderator who will give voice. We're expecting probably between like 40 and 50 people on this call. So we are trying to make sure that we get as much time with our panelists as possible. And we will be wrapping up at 5 o'clock prompt. Please don't post questions in the, you're welcome to use the chat, but we just can't monitor the chat as well as we would like. So QA that you would like to go to the panelists, please put them in the QA feature. With many, many thanks. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists. We are joined by some wonderful, fantastic people. Trevor Buffoni is a lecturer in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program at the University of Houston and a high school teacher at Bellaire High School. His work using TikTok with his students has been featured on Good Morning America, ABC News, Inside Edition, and Access Hollywood, among numerous national media platforms. He is the author of Renegades, Digital Dance Cultures from Dub Smash to TikTok, and the co-author of Latinx Teens, U.S. Popular Culture on Page, Stage, and Screen. And he has co-edited 5 collections on Latinx cultural studies, including Shakespeare and Latinidad. So welcome, Trevor. Thank you for being here with us. Yeah, then we also have Carla De La Gata, who is an assistant professor of English at Florida State University. She is a theater historian and performance theorist who examines ethnic and bilingual theater through dramaturgy and orality. She is the author of Latinx Shakespeare's Staging U.S. Intracultural Theater and the co-editor of Shakespeare and Latinidad. She received the J. Leeds Barrel Dissertation Prize from the Shakespeare Association of America for her work on Shakespeare and Latinidad. She has received awards and fellowships from the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, the New York Public Library, Folger Shakespeare Library, and the American Society for Theater Research. Dr. De La Gata is on the advisory board for the Latinx Theater Commons. She's worked as a scholar for Shakespeare Center Los Angeles, the Public Theater, Chicago Shakespeare Theater, Shakespeare Theater Company, and Victory Gardens Theater. And she's on the editorial board of several journals and the Arden series on Shakespeare and social justice. So welcome, Carla. Thank you for being here with us. We have David Sterling Brown, a Shakespeare and pre-modern critical race studies scholar who is an assistant professor of English at Binghamton University. He is a co-editor of Shakespeare Bulletin's 2022 special issue on social justice in contemporary performance, and he is the senior editor of the forthcoming 2022 Shakespeare Studies Forum. His anti-racist research, which centers on pedagogy and how racial ideologies circulate in and beyond the early modern period, is published or forthcoming in several peer-reviewed and public venues, such as Shakespeare and Digital Pedagogy, Literature Compass, Radical Teacher, The Hair, Hamlet, The State of the Play, Lockdown Shakespeare, Public Books, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. His forthcoming book projects, one of which is under contract with Cambridge UP, examine the color line and Shakespearean drama. Through his 2021 to 23 Mellon ACLS Scholars in Society Fellowship, Dr. Brown currently has a residency with the Racial Imaginary Institute founded by Claudia Rankine. So thank you for being here with us, David. Welcome. And last but certainly not least, Melissa E. Sanchez is the Donald T. Reagan Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of Queer Faith, Reading Promiscuity and Race in the Secular Love Tradition, which reassesses key texts of the prehistory of modern monogamy from Paul to Luther, Petrarch to Shakespeare, to show that writing assumed to promote fidelity, in fact, articulates the perversity of desire and the elusiveness of self-knowledge. Shakespeare and Queer Theory, which introduces students and scholars to the field of queer theory, Shakespeare studies, and the interchanges between them, and Erotic Subjects, the sexuality of politics in early modern English literature, which examines how 16th and 17th century writers used scenarios of erotic violence and cross-gender identification to explore the origins and limits of political allegiance. She is the director for the Center for Research in Feminist, Queer, and Transgender Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. So welcome, Melissa. Thank you for being here with us. We're going to start with a brief overview of our panelists' research. We will start with Trevor, if you would like to tell us a little something about what you work on.
Thank you for having me. And I also want to thank Meredith Conte as well. Yeah, I was going to share my screen, but I can't share my screen. Oh, wait, I can. Okay. It happens. So I just have a few things I want to show you. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. So most of my work with Shakespeare looks at, and I'm going to start my timer so I do not go over, but most of my work with Shakespeare looks at Latinx Shakespeare's, and I've done a few different projects in this realm, right? I helped co-organize Shakespeare in the Borderlands Symposium in San Antonio a few years ago with a few other Shakespeare scholars and Latinx theater folks. And also with Carla here, I co-edited Shakespeare and Latinidad, which came out last year. And so there's a lot of things kind of in the ether, but most of my work with theater is, most of my work is traditionally has been in Latinx theater, but my current projects are about TikTok. And so specifically, I'm looking at TikTok's relationship to theater and how TikTok itself is both a performance space and also a space for culture making. And so I have two books that have come out in the last year or so, right? I have Renegades, which looks at specifically like dance cultures on these apps. And then also I edited a book that came out this week, actually, TikTok cultures in the US. So if you're interested in TikTok, these are like your two spots to go. But in general, theater has had a tremendous impact on TikTok, something that's a holdover from when TikTok was Musical.ly in 2018. And we can see this through the way that different sound bites from musicals will dominate on the platform, from Beetlejuice 6, Heathers, La La Land, In the Heights, and also how new shows like Ratatouille, the TikTok musical, Bridgerton, the musical, which just won a Grammy, right? And also For You page, they demonstrate how artists approach the platform as a space to make new material, right? And new full-length musicals. And so TikTok is really the site to market theater, but also to make theater and create fan experiences, right? And so when this panel came up, I was like, I could talk about Latinx stuff, but Latinx Shakespeare, but I'm kind of interested in seeing what Shakespeare looks like on TikTok. And so I'm wondering, how does Shakespeare fit into this phenomenon, right? Specifically, TikTok at large, but also TikTok as a theater space. Is there a Shakestalk? Is there a Shakespeare TikTok? Or is there even a 12th Night TikTok? So I did some, number crunching, and here's the most popular hashtags with Shakespeare in terms of video views. Now, you can see Shakespeare by itself has 311 million views, and then the other ones are kind of small. And then 12th Night, hashtag 12th Night has 3.4 million views. These are actually really small numbers. On TikTok, if you think about, I could post a video and it could have easily 5 million views, just the one video. So this is actually not a lot. And if we can compare this to like other, theater trends on TikTok, it's much less substantial. So for instance, the like hashtag In the Heights challenge, there's over 12 billion, like with a B, right? Video views, or the Blackout challenge from In the Heights has over 800,000 views. I'm sorry, videos, 800,000 videos, right? And then other things like Martha Dump Truck in the Flesh from Heathers the Musical, and has over 2.7 million videos, right? So this is actually not a lot. But also sometimes with hashtags, it depends on what is being hashtagged, right? Or what is not being hashtagged. So anyway, based on how TikTok works, every user has a specific user experience, right? Based on the algorithm, right? That feeds them content that they want. And so TikTokers who are posting things about Shakespeare or things about 12th Night, for instance, can really find a community of people looking at those specific things, right? And so, for instance, if I'm in a production of Twelfth Night and I post a video of that, then I'm automatically going to be linked to other people doing similar things, right? And so it creates this like sub community, okay? And so when I started looking at Twelfth Night, and I don't know why it's not going, there we go. 12th Night specifically on TikTok, I was seeing how TikTokers were using this to remix the plays and characters, dramaturgy with TikTok's aesthetics, right? The idiosyncratic humor, the silliness, the like chaotic messiness, self-deprecating humor, so on and so forth, right? And how specifically TikTokers are playing with the queerness of of 12th Night, something that's been co-opted by queer theater nerds, some of whom have been in productions or are in productions of 12th Night. And they use this platform to quote, like get into character or as a digital stage door to interact with fans or people that might be friends with them or have seen the production. And so what they're doing is, and I'll show you a few examples really quick, they marry popular TikTok trends, right? Which even if you're not on TikTok, you might have heard of some of these sound bites or you've seen some of these trends, but they marry those TikTok trends with the dramaturgy of 12th Night. And in some cases, 12th Night becomes a fundamental part of their TikTok aesthetics and persona. So I don't think we have enough time to look at all of these, but I want to show you a few of these. And you'll notice these 3 different TikTokers, they all have time. So I'm going to drop this link in the chat, but I'll show you really quickly. I'll drop this in so you can look at it later if you want to watch the videos. I really went too fast here. Basically, all of these are, no, we're not going to watch. Significant follower accounts, and they're doing queer TikTok in the Shakespeare TikTok. So I'm sorry, I really did not budget my time well at all, but I'm so excited to be here, and I will drop this link for this presentation in the chat. You can watch these videos later. Thank you. That was fast.
Thank you so much, Trevor. Carla, would you give us a little overview of the kinds of things you're thinking about?
Yes, so, and thank you again for inviting me. I'm just so happy to be here and to be in conversation with all of these wonderful scholars. So Twelfth Night is Shakespeare's most musical play, but it also involves gender subversion and immigrants. My research centers on contemporary stage performance, and I specialize in ethnic and bilingual adaptations of Shakespeare. My work on Latinx Shakespeares attends to how a culture that was not conceived of as an ethnic category in the early modern period can be integrated into Shakespeare's works. So whereas other cultural and ethnic and religious groups may have little representation or faulty representation in Shakespeare, the concept of Latino was not actually yet in play during the early modern period. Within the more than 150 Latinx-themed Shakespeare productions and adaptations that I've tracked over the last decade of research, over 25% of them are Romeo and Juliet or Romeo and Juliet based. But the next most popular Shakespeare play to be adapted into Latinx culture is Twelfth Night, and more than 10% of Latinx productions take up this play. Within that 10%, there are at least half of that number have to do with productions that take up Viola and Sebastian coming from Cuba to the United States, whether in the 1920s, 30s, 1950s. In 2017, the Public Theater in New York, their Public Mobile did a Twelfth Night in which the twins were coming from coastal Florida. All of this started, the Latinx themed ones in 1998 with the East LA Classic Theater Company doing an MTV salsa style 12th Night and kind of livening it up there. Oftentimes, Latinx culture is theatricalized through an oral excess, through an embellishment of language, typically the Spanish language, and accents and musicality and sounds and silences. When productions include Spanish and sometimes other languages as well, they enhance the effective quality of whichever culture is being performed. Latinx, Filipino, I have seen all different types through music and sounds. So sometimes language is integrated into the text itself, but other times we hear the music, and with Twelfth Night's excessive music, it's an opportunity to embellish an ethnic construct without adding dialogue or changing the words of the dialogue itself. The storyline of 2 undocumented foreigners, each finding a way of support through Viola's work as a domestic worker for Orsino and Sebastian's monetary support from Antonio's affection. the audience is reminded of the contingent power of a marital contract in the advancement of an immigrant's quest for citizenship. And so in performance, contemporary audiences can easily make this analogy and connection, even if it's not in fact part of the dramaturgy or casting or explicit concept of the show. But Twelfth Night does not take up ethnic division, at least textually. The play is predicated on gender subversion and homosexuality and perhaps homosexuality, and Antonio's supporter, Sebastian. When these non-normative relationships of gender and sexuality are designed for comedy, but mapped onto an identifiably immigrant narrative, they may take on a palimpsest of marginalized identity elements that make the fate and the coupling of the characters quite different in tone. So what this actually means is that when the play is transposed to a different culture, the elements that are already in the text become amplified and some other ones get played down. Along with gender and sexuality, as we know in Twelfth Night, the class dynamics are also confused in the play. And so with so much instability, one of the things that I see in the productions that I'm looking at is that certain elements of the text are brought out because of the staging concept. Although Latinx Shakespeares are dominated by Romeo and Juliet, the Shakespeare play I know best is Twelfth Night. When I was an undergraduate at Berkeley, I took a course with a professor named Stephen Booth, a wonderful scholar and during that 15 weeks, we read one play, Twelfth Night. He took us through the meaning of every single word and the definition from the Oxford English Dictionary. And so for me, when I see this play in production, more so than any other play, I know when they cut a line, I know when they change something, I can tell you all of the edits of this work. For me, I find a great deal of pleasure in that, sometimes frustrating, because I wish I did not know it so well. But one of the things that I've seen again and again with Viola and Sebastian is how these two twins are brought back together, oftentimes through language. The director, Tim Supple, did a production that was later filmed with the actress Parminda Negra and Chiwetel Ejiofor, and who played Orsino. But when Viola and Sebastian are brought together, they speak their home language, and that is kind of the way that twins are unified and the way that we know their connection and understand them. So that is where my work kind of intervenes with this play, and I will pass it along to David.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you, Cooper and Cooper, for providing this space. Race, and even class. In other words, identity and its onstage representation. Throughout Shakespeare's canon, white hands manufacture explicit meaning that allows the playwright to compose a socially, politically, and culturally significant narrative about whiteness, masculinity, and femininity. Specifically, the white hand, which belongs to women physically and men rhetorically in the plays, is a highly scrutinized object and recurring motif in the canon, which does not highlight the exact phrase black hand, perhaps predictably so. Beginning with Love's Labour's Lost and ending with The Winter's Tale, the exact phrase white hand appears several times in and at least several plays and across all genres, comedy, tragedy, history, and romance. In these plays, this corporeal extremity is always attached to a white body, a woman's body. The white hand functions as a fundamental agent of white self-fashioning that is inherently feminized, though always through masculine articulation in discourse centered on a range of topics, such as commitment, love, beauty, virtue, honor, validation, modesty, sexual purity, and domestic concerns. Yet, as Arthur L. Little Jr. observes, however much whiteness seems to communicate an authentic cultural sense of purity, divinity, and power, it remains a theatrical device and thus inauthentic. In Act 2, Scene 3, Twelfth Night's fool asserts, in an otherwise nonsensical reply to Sir Andrew, "My lady has a white hand." Despite its seeming randomness, his statement denotes how the lady's white hand is a recognizable racialized symbol whose meaning, which is linked to domestic relations and relationships, transcends class boundaries. The white hand is important to the fool, just as it is important to other white Shakespearean figures like Cleopatra's Antony and Leontes in The Winter's Tale. In the canon, then, Shakespeare depicts the white hand as indisputable white property, and even male property, that overtly and covertly validates white patriarchal power and verifies honor associated with the white identity, among other things. The fool's white hand language from Twelfth Night, and even similar color-coded language in Shakespeare's plays such as Romeo and Juliet and Titus Andronicus, suggests that even as it pertains to an object like the hand, racial identity remains an important component of social appraisal, as Robert M. Entman and Andrew Rojecki argue in The Black Image in the White Mind. My other scholarly engagement with Twelfth Night will appear this summer in Arden's forthcoming Lockdown Shakespeare edited collection as a co-authored publication with my friend, actor, author, creative producer, Ben Crystal. When the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown started in 2020, practically all theater practitioners were forced to either halt or reimagine their work. Ben Crystal and his Shakespeare ensemble decided to embrace the digital arts, and they created an innovative Twelfth Night adaptation called What You Will, and I'll try to put a link to that in the chat. And this virtual production aimed to provide insight into the internal machinations of several of the play's characters, diving deeply into their individual predicaments and mindsets. In the Shakespeare Ensemble's production, Belch's set, for example, was framed by addiction and alcoholism. And Olivia was, of course, consumed by grief. Olivia was played by Renee Rose, a Black actress from the United States. And I mentioned that because the Shakespeare Ensemble was deliberate in its color-conscious casting here, as Olivia's depiction of grief told a story that is likely familiar to many. In fact, 2020 had a very challenging set of moments that were overrun with grief for a lot of people, especially Black people in America, when we think about that summer and George Floyd, et cetera. In closing, I'll note that we can situate Twelfth Night among what I previously described as on a Shakespeare Association of America panel as Shakespeare's other race plays. For the forthcoming 50th volume of Shakespeare Studies, fall 2022, I'm serving as senior editor of the journal's Forum. And in the Forum introduction titled Seeking the Invisible, Whiteness and Shakespeare Studies, I and my co-editors, Patricia Akini and Arthur Little Jr., note that the essays we have brought together in the Forum take up the other of Shakespeare's other race plays by outing whiteness, making more visible its workings in Shakespeare. And by doing so, making visible the racial marks and bruises it deploys on its way not just to white people making, but the seemingly benign institutionalization of Shakespeare as the innocent, humanistic emblem of white superiority and white supremacy. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I would like to kick it over to Melissa. Would you tell us a little bit about the things you think about, how they intersect with the play? Oh, you're muted.
You would think after 2 years of Zoom, I would know how to unmute myself, but somehow I have not quite mastered this yet. So thank you so much, Meredith and Danielle, for having me here today. I really enjoyed taking the time to think about Twelfth Night. And I've enjoyed hearing all of these papers and look forward to the discussion. My own work recently has centered on the intersections between feminism, queer theory, trans theory, and race studies in early modern texts. And in thinking about Twelfth Night, I've picked up a thread from some previous essays that I've written about figures of eunuchs in early modern poetry and drama, including some, lyric poems of conversion by Richard Crashaw, and the figure of Marty and the Eunuch in Antony and Cleopatra. So in Twelfth Night, I'm particularly interested in how Viola's disguised not by her own description as a boy, right? So unlike, say, Rosaline in As You Like It, she doesn't disguise herself as a boy or a page, but she specifically asks to be disguised and introduced as a eunuch. And I'm would be interested in talking with those who know more about performance history to hear how you would actually stage, what would be the difference in costuming between a eunuch and a boy. But her disguise not only specifically as a eunuch, but as a eunuch whose name Cesario renders her a personification of castration. She's, her name signifies that she's literally been cut. And this draws attention, I think, to a long tradition of imperial mutilation and abduction of boys, one that has been traced at length by Anthony Bosman, Howard Chang, Catherine Crawford, and my colleague at Penn, Hamid Arvas. The name Cesario, I think, also gestures at the three types of eunuchs described by the Gospel of Matthew and designates Cesario not just as any eunuch, but as the second type of eunuch described here. As the Geneva translation of Matthew has it, there are some eunuchs which were so born from their mother's womb. There are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men, and there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuch for the kingdom of heaven's sake. So the first two categories are Bursten and Gelden men, whether born that way or so made because they should keep the chambers of noble women, for they were judged chaste, and the third were given the gift of continence by God. So Cesario is a gelded man, so made in order to be judged chaste enough to keep the chambers of noble women, Olivia in the case of Twelfth Night. Both the 16th century Geneva gloss and Shakespeare's play evoke the eunuchs of the Turkish harem, figures who were implicated in detailed racial and sexual hierarchies. As several scholars have noted, Twelfth Night is set in Illyria, which was a tributary of the Ottoman Empire. And this site underscores Cesario's potential racialized difference. Arvas has traced the complexity of Turkish eunuchs in early modern thought, in which white eunuchs, Turkish or Christian captives, were preferred and privileged over Black eunuchs abducted from Africa in Ottoman harems. The frequent description of Cesario as a boy and attention to his singing by others in the play additionally associates him with Italian castrati, again distancing Cesario from the properly white, Christian, masculine English boy who could grow up to be a man. Anthony Bosman explains that one visible effect of castration before puberty is indeed a pale, smooth skin. Modern medicine confirms classical and Renaissance observations that a eunuch is bearded and looks bleached. Incapable of erection or penetration, the eunuch is aligned with women, and particularly with same-sex female eroticism, as in Cleopatra's line, as well a woman with a eunuch played as with a woman. I'll wrap up now just by saying that along with this, what Cesario brings to the play as specifically designated a eunuch is the imbrication of violence and racialization and gender nonconformity and pleasure, with violence being part of the appeal of the eunuch. This also brings to Twelfth Night what Suzanne Wofford has called foreign emotions, including the Orientalist fantasies of pleasure described by Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, fantasies of Saracen enjoyment unavailable to properly white Christians. These pleasures hinge on gender and racial ambiguity, as well as the potential eroticism of sadism and domination. And I'll end there. I have a lot more to say, but I'll stop in the interest of time. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for this fascinating, just like the tiniest introduction to the ways that your research intersects with this play. I have a few prepared questions. All of them are far more vast than we can tackle in the time we have, but hopefully will also give us just little tastes of how you think about this play from your corner of the world. And then we will open up the floor to questions. Again, audience, if you have questions, please put them in the QA feature, the button sort of down in the toolbar there. So the first question I have for the panel is, where do you see identities and cultural communities being formed and reformed in this play? Where do you see these processes pop up most unexpectedly?
Well, I'll jump in. I know it's always awkward on the Zoom because we can't read the cues, but this is kind of where I was going before I like dramatically over prepared the 5 minutes. But basically what I'm looking at, and this is a very new thing for me, or at least the 12th night part, is looking at how queer teenagers and queer like 20-something-year-olds, right, Gen Z, how they're using the dramaturgy of 12th Night, right? And the plays like Inherent Queerness, right? As a way to perform their queerness, right? And create these, I talk about with TikTok and different social medias, how they're basically, people are creating identity blueprints, right? And then, so I create one, and then Danielle recreates what I did, and then Melissa does it, David does it, so on and so forth. And it creates this like sense of general, or not general, but generational identity, right? And so these teens are using Shakespeare as the place that they're doing this, right? That they're being queer and talking about being queer and performing that queerness. And so that's kind of something I'm thinking about. It's not just a 12th night thing. I was sending, if anyone's interested, just look me up, email me, DM me, whatever, and I'll send you some other videos that are quite funny, looking at, you know, ranking how queer Shakespeare's plays are from like 1 to 10, right? And it's not just like, this is what happens in this play. It's very much riffing, playing off the play title, playing off the characters, reading into it, things that might not even be there, right? That's part of the humor of a place like TikTok, where chaos is supreme and silliness is like the norm. Now you all had some time to think about what you're gonna say, so go for it.
Well,
oh no, go ahead, please.
One of the things that we see in performance quite often is that the narrative, rather than starting with Orsino, will start with Viola and her tempest, and she is shipwrecked. And so what this can mean is that it kind of centers her and her story, and beginning with that. But we also get to see her kind of we see her response to being in a new world before we hear Orsino and talking about what his goal is going to be in this narrative. When that happens, I think some of the community, the question about community that's created is her rapport with the sea captain, who we see once and then that's it, but also about her ability to trust a man, and what that relationship can be. So for an example, in a production at Courage Theater in Los Angeles in 2016, they staged Viola and Sebastian as Filipino immigrants who would come. And so the production started outside of a theater, kind of near a baseball game, and a VW bus drove up. And then we see the role of the sea captain was kind of split between the driver who drops Viola off safely in this new place, but then attempts to assault her and she pushes him back. And then this man comes up and offers her a guitar, and that's actually Festi the clown. And then this Viola sings, which we don't get in 12th Night, and she actually performs the song. And so we kind of get a different type of community that's created between all these characters, as the audience was standing literally outside, kind of watching this whole thing occur at one time. So I guess for me, one of the things that's most striking is how Viola's character and the different interactions that she has with men before she becomes Cesario can actually be portrayed in performance by beginning the play with her.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, one of the things that I'm interested in the way that 12th Night has been received is the focus on Viola as, you know, a queer figure as opposed to as a non-binary or trans figure. And so thinking about your question, Danielle, about categories of identity and identification, you know, it's so interesting to me that Viola wants, you know, that she's so specific about being a eunuch as opposed to a boy. And then thinking about how that choice resonates throughout the play and its various power relations and gendered and racial relationships.
I'll just add really quickly, like as I think about community, particularly along the lines of gender and queerness, I can't help but want to move in the direction of intersectionality and consider the ways that, you know, what does it mean to be white and queer versus Black and queer, or Latino, or Latina and queer. And so those are some of the things that I think about too, as I'm exploring ideas about race in this play, because this is a play that certainly forces us to look at and deal with and think about whiteness, which, you know, there are nuances to that racial category as well. And I think it's important to consider those as we think about this question of community, identity, belonging, et cetera.
Thank you so much. That's a fantastic segue into my next question, which is how do the expressions of gender and racial identity in Twelfth Night converge with or push against those being expressed in popular culture, either now or in Shakespeare's time or in any other subset of time before or since?
I'll start. So something that struck me as I was, and struck me like very recently, as I was thinking about this, you know, the term fair comes up a number of times in this play, I think about 14 times or so, and it's used in reference to characters. I think fair Olivia is one of the phrases that's used. And I was struck by how, one, whiteness is centered, and it is also, the play itself does work to out the whiteness. Yet when I think about our modern world and contemporary society, it's funny to me, like if you refer to a white person as white, that can oftentimes produce discomfort, and it can produce awkwardness, or sometimes even people have been accused of being racist by naming whiteness. And so it's just funny to me that it's so overt in Shakespeare's play through the term fair, which is synonymous with white at times. But in our modern world, there's still this very contentious mindset really around acknowledging whiteness, making it visible. And so that was something that I think is important to consider in relationship to popular culture, because TikTok is an interesting space to consider when you think about what's going on with race and even the appropriation of racial identities and culture, et cetera. So that's one thing.
Yeah, thanks, David. I mean, adding, you know, kind of joining in with what you said in the last answer and adding to that, one of the bits that I had prepared that I didn't talk about is the description of Cesario as a fair young man. And in, you know, the longer version, Trevor, you're not the only one who over prepared. In the longer version, I was trying to think about that description through Bosman's work on this association of castration with pale, smooth skin, and this idea that the eunuch is beardless and looks bleached. So I feel like one of the things that thinking about Viola's choice of you know, dressing up as not just a boy, but a eunuch, I think also makes us complicate discourses of whiteness in the play. And to think about these, you know, to think about these historically specific, you know, very complex understandings of racialization as it ties up with religion and sexuality. And I feel like, coming back to your earlier point, David, what that reminds us is that, queerness is always intersectional, right? Because gender and sexuality are always racialized. And I think that when Cesario's eunuchness, I don't know what the adjective would be, is effaced, and the character's treated as, simply a figure for queer desire, what you also get is a flattening out of the racial complexity of the play, and a sense that queerness is always white, when in fact the whole character pushes against that.
I was just thinking of what you just said, Melissa, and I dropped a link for my book with the promo code. Anyway,
cool. Thanks.
Because what David said reminded me of my book. But something that I was gonna get to is that one of the popular Shakespeare TikTokers, their bio says, "Make the classics less classist," right? And then their content is almost all queer, right? And so they're automatically coming at it from this intersectional space, where to do anti-classist work, decolonize classism, I don't know what I'm trying to say. I think y'all got it though. You have to do it in a queer way, in a way that looks at race, in a way that looks at ability, disability, all of these other different things. It's automatically intersectional for a lot of young people in a way that I think older folks, including myself and beyond, sometimes can't wrap their heads around, right? But for young people, like I teach high school students, they're insane. I love them. I almost did this panel in my classroom, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to take off today. But they're automatically, they're generationally thinking about all of these things through an intersectional lens by default.
I have a very different type of response to the question. And one of the scenes that I enjoy the most is when Viola as Cesario goes to woo Olivia for the first time and gives an account of her face and can make a list and almost monetize, right? 2 eyes, 2 lips, they're perfect. And she goes through this whole list kind of in the way, and to me, it's one of those moments where we know as the audience that it's a female character disguised as a eunuch or disguised as a boy, a eunuch. But a woman is inventorying another woman, the way that those critiques sometimes go on about the judgment between genders and between a number of genders, but the way that one woman can critique another, knowing that what society values. Excuse me. And she makes the comment, 'tis beautiful, yes, if it's all natural, if it's all made by God, right? And so we even get this early critique of how much of you have you changed yourself in order to please society. And I think this, with my students, just rings true all the time. This is the same type of critique that people experience today, that women place on other women as well. And there's something about the delivery of that scene, which is also the scene where Olivia first gets excited by Cesario, and the way that being born into such beauty is portrayed as negative, but also does her some good. And then she finds that same description and inventory. She finds the person who does that attractive. And the complexity of that and the psychology of that is something that we're still very much engaged with today. So I think that that's important from a gender perspective, especially in the classroom.
Thank you so much, everybody. And thinking about gender and commodification and economics also segues us into our next question, which is we obviously are a university community and we do theater. So we were wondering what comments you might have about some productive ways to think about casting early modern plays, particularly when university theater communities, including ours, are attempting to take steps to adopt inclusive casting processes and right a lot of prior wrongs.
Well, I'll start. The number one thing that I always recommend, I've talked to several theaters about casting, and I've been brought in to advise on that. in breaking down, I actually kind of divided between 9 different types of casting. But the number one thing to start with is that everyone involved in the production, not just the director and the cast, but all the other designers and people who are involved, to be clear on what the intention is. Even if it's not legible to the audience, even if some people disagree with why casting choices are made, just to be explicit and transparent as to why those choices were made. And sometimes, as we all know in the theater world, because those are the people who auditioned, and we need to work on a different pipeline and so forth. But if there are strategies and choices in the dramaturgy, and I consider casting an artistic and aesthetic practice that is part of the dramaturgy, that it needs to be made explicit, and we also understand that it's not perfect and that it's part of an artistic process. So I know that sounds a little bit vague, but there's much conversation about casting, and I always just want to start off with, if you don't know why the choices have been made, then I think it causes more confusion than anything.
I'll jump in really quickly. I think something that's been useful, like when I reference Ben Crystal's What You Will, color conscious casting can be an important inroad into facilitating conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion, and of course, increasing visibility on the stage of particular racial backgrounds, et cetera, different bodies, because it's not just optically that people get race, we also get it orally. We hear race, as Jennifer Stover talks about in the Sonic color line. And I think it's important too to slow down the processes of putting together production. So like right now, literally in about 40 minutes, I'm moving over to work with Keith Hamilton Cobb on the Untitled Othello project and doing dramaturgical work there. And we're slowing down the process and just looking at the text, not focused on the product, which would be the play that will be staged, but the actual process of getting to that point and really thinking through things, however long it takes, right? So we're not trying to throw up a production in 3 weeks. And when you do that, you miss opportunities to have conversations about inclusivity, diversity, equity, et cetera. And then another thing that I've appreciated in terms of plays that I have seen, and this can easily be done on college campuses in terms of productions, is talkbacks after productions. That's another opportunity to slow down with your audience, and to Carla's point, thinking about intentions or even motivations, have conversations with your audience about why you made certain choices, or let them ask or challenge or whatever. But I think more dialogue is needed in these processes of theatrical production, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, so as I said, I tend not to be very good with the actual staging of plays. I read them more like poems often, but I think one of the things that strikes me about casting decisions and reactions to casting decisions is they make us confront what we were imagining or assuming about the play. So, what do we assume that Olivia or Viola look like? What do we assume, to take David's point, that they speak like? And I'm thinking also, for instance, Trevor, you brought up ability in your answer a couple of questions ago, and I'm thinking about a production of As You Like It that had a deaf actress cast in the part of Celia. And so, these various casting choices can make us really question our own assumptions about, racial and gendered and ethnic and able or disabled embodiment, and ways that our own expectations for what Shakespeare is doing. And this, again, for me, is one of the things that's interested in thinking about Viola as dressing up, not as a boy, but as a eunuch. I think that when I think that assumptions about what Shakespeare means also forget that Shakespeare is himself, located at this time that understood history and embodiment in very different ways than we do now. So questions of anachronism and diversity might actually be just as much applied to what Shakespeare was doing with his sources and his cultural context as to what we're doing now.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Trevor, did you have a casting thought or should I move on?
I'll just say really quickly, and I think everyone kind of said it really perfectly, but I think there's a difference between, traditionally we've heard like colorblind, but colorblind doesn't actually exist. Like David was saying, color conscious, because the audience is going to bring in whatever baggage or, whatever experiences they're having, they're going to bring into the theater. And so, we can see things like, this is not Shakespeare, but the Carousel revival on Broadway a few years ago that cast a Black man as Billy Bigelow, right, who beats his white wife, right? And they were like, oh, it's colorblind, it's color, not conscious. And inevitably, it opens up these questions about what does it mean to stage something like that? So I think with college theaters, especially, because we're trying to give a lot of students opportunities, right? Students across identity markers, opportunities to play different roles. Sometimes we can lose that kind of what is actually happening racially or identity-wise. So nothing that new, but something to be mindful of.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. I have one more question from me, and then we're going to start opening the floor for questions. Again, audience, if you have questions, pop them into the QA, and we will bring them to our panelists. So my question is, what excites you about 12th Night?
I like the anything that provides a conversation around real world, real raw stuff excites me. So for instance, within the Shakespeare Ensemble's What You Will, which they pulled from this play and then sort of dove into Belch's character and all the other characters they had. But thinking about real issues like addiction and alcoholism and abuse and what prompts it, that excites me because it means that in my classroom, for instance, I can facilitate conversations with students about things that are very relevant to their world on campus, or maybe even their lives beyond the campus world. There's that figure, like I was thinking about Saturday Night Live. They have that drunk uncle character who comes on sometimes, and that's a real figure in some people's families, and they are oftentimes a source of comedy, but there's also something tragic there as well. And so the tensions that exist within this play also excite me, because of course Belch is a source of comedic relief, but when you really, again, slow down and think about his issue, it's not so funny. So I love that tension.
I could answer the other question that you had, which is what makes me laugh about 12th Night. And I would say one of the, what I find, the scenes that I find most delightful about 12th Night are the scenes that are similar to the Comedy of Errors, these moments of confused identity where everyone thinks that, Sebastian's ripping them off, or, what both makes me laugh about those and what I think is really fun and exciting about them is the way that they really draw attention to the fact that identity isn't like an essential true thing about you, but also something that's imposed upon you. And so even as they're very fun,
Okay, we're good. Are we good, Danielle? Ian? Okay. Okay. No, but I love plays like this that provide a lot of different opportunities for conversation with young people, whether it's about the, cross-dressing or queerness or gender or class or whatever it might be. It provides like an easy entry point into a more nuanced, more in-depth conversation. And so I've always been appreciative of that kind of stuff. And I don't know, I think it's exciting. I love, of Shakespeare, I think Twelfth Night to me has the, makes me laugh. I love the adaptations, right, that we keep getting. And I'm a millennial, and like She's the Man is like a core part of millennial culture. And so, yeah. And it's still something that we're seeing, and kids today even like love these adaptations, and they might not even realize they're engaging with Twelfth Night, but they actually are. And so like Shakespeare is everywhere. It's brilliant.
I think for me, what I like is how confusion is just embedded in the play at every turn. So when you start the play with Orsino, and he says that he's wooing Olivia and this woman who has just lost her father and her brother, and she's in mourning. And then in the next scene, we get a woman who says that she's lost her father and her brother, and we don't know her name if we're watching the show. As a reader, it says Viola, and we know that that's a different character. But if you're seeing the show for the first time, you would actually think that this is the woman who Orsino had just talked about. And Viola and Olivia are only off by one letter. And so it's so, I'm not saying they're anagrams of each other, but what we get is confusion in our master poet writer, right? And the way that he's able to embed it kind of, as I said, at every turn. And that makes me laugh, and it does excite me as well. And some of the possibilities, again, for the first 15 times I saw this play, I didn't think of it as an immigrant story in the terms that it's been adapted to very often, especially in the last 20 years. But there are ways of bringing that out. And I think it becomes more and more resonant depending on our changed cultural moment. But the way that we're able to understand this story, as Trevor, as everyone has been saying again and again, that it is part of our culture, and that it kind of replays in different ways, I think is just fascinating. The other thing that I really like compared to some of Shakespeare's other comedies is that we see some people making the same choices and having very different results in the end. What happens to Malvolio is quite different, when he tries to move up a class. And we also get Olivia's snobbery when she says she does not care to marry above her rank. And I think that class snobbery going in a number of different ways is an important conversation to have as well. So as you could tell, 12th Night, that one semester in college did a lot for me, spending it. And I did forget to mention, not only did we spend one semester reading it, but we had to perform in it as well. So I'm gonna leave it at that.
Thank you, everyone. And my apologies for my internet being unstable, apparently, but here we are. The show is going on. We are opening the floor for questions from the audience. We have a question from Barbara Bono, who asks, why can't Cesario stay a eunuch? And this combines nicely, Ian notes, with Andrew Sofer's question. If Cesario appeared on stage dressed recognizably as a eunuch, then it is Sebastian dressed as a eunuch too. And he quotes, "He went still in this fashion, color, ornament, for him I imitate." What would that visual twinning signify? I'm also curious why Cesario never sings, as Carla pointed out, since that would emphasize his uniqueness. E-U-N-U, eunuch, unique. Yes, it's a wonderful play. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Barbara. So that is the first sort of combined audience question here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, so in a sense, Barbara's question is also my question, like, does it, or maybe not exactly, but does Cesario stay a eunuch at the end? Hang on, let me pull this up. Orsino's famous last words, Cesario, come, for so you shall be while you are a man. But when in other habits you are seen, Orsino's mistress and his fancy's queen. So that a lot has been made of those lines, and the you know, for me, what's so interesting is that it's the habits that, you know, the clothing that make Cesario into a man or a mistress and fancies queen. And, you know, the mistress and fancies queen is never, it's not quite a woman. So, you know, again, thinking to eunuchs in Antony and Cleopatra and that line, as well, a woman is with a eunuch play that Cleopatra says to Mardian, you know, makes me wonder, is Cesario's appeal to Orsino that he is a eunuch, or at least can be imagined as a eunuch? Like, what would be the fantasy of the eunuch, of Cesario as eunuch? I actually hadn't thought about that with Sebastian's costume, but I think that's brilliant. And it does, you know, I wish that I knew more about, you know, performance history of the play, because I'm interested in, you know, thinking, what would it be to dress up as a eunuch, as opposed to a boy? And is evidently Sebastian's dressed that, you know, Sebastian and Cesario are dressed that way too. So how do we even imagine that visually speaking? Great questions.
If we have no more unique thoughts, we have another question from Barbara Bono, who identifies with Carla's starting point of having spent an entire semester on Twelfth Night with Stephen Booth. Could Carla elaborate a bit more on how Violet and Sebastian are brought together by language at the end of this play, and what the affect and the musicality of that might be?
Yes, and that's a great question. And so the twins in this play, we don't get to see together until the end. And so we first are introduced to Sebastian kind of late in the play. We hear about him, and then we take over with the whole wooing and Orsino and so forth. So it can be a challenge for the actors and for the audience to remember that she's mourning the loss of her brother, and she does that by dressing up like him, right? And so, but we don't get this kind of sadness about that. And even Olivia says she's going to mourn her father and brother for years, and then she sees Cesario, she's like, I'm done mourning, right? You know, and so this whole idea of excessive mourning, which would have been funny, right? And out of fashion, kind of just gets thrown aside. So when Sebastian appears, we have this lengthy dialogue. Do I stand here? Do I see my father had a mole upon his brow? And usually this is incredibly funny because the two people are dressed exactly the same, and they're made by the hair and makeup to look pretty similar, and casting choices as well. So it's an opportunity where we don't need in performance to hear all of the lines, that if you don't understand them, you're getting the main idea. So in a number of productions, including the Tim Supple one, including a number of Latinx Shakespeares, they'll default to a different language, which shows the connection between Cesario and Sebastian, and we get that they're related. So not only is the visual of the connection there, but we get the auditory and the oral connection between them as well. And if we miss some of the context of the lines because the audience doesn't speak that language, that's okay too. They're not integral to the plot. So it's a way of making their connection even more apparent, and also signaling in this moment of high comedy, like, oh, there's someone else just looking like you, standing right across from you on stage. In this moment of comedy, we get that they had both been mourning each other. And at the same time, we usually get Olivia's facial expression, right? It's like, wait, did I marry the right person? We get Orsino's expression, everyone's in shock. And what it does is that it can change the tone that's occurring on stage, right? And it also does remind us of what I'm calling the immigrant narrative aspect of this play. So that's where I've seen people invoke another language on stage, because again, the dialogue isn't necessary for understanding the next portion of the plot.
We have Tyler points out that As You Like It has been briefly mentioned a couple of times, a play that they have an enormous academic soft spot for. Have any of the panelists looked into the thematic links between these two plays and the ways they could inform each other?
Well, one of the things that comes up, there are a number of scholars who've done such excellent work in looking at these two plays. And yes, there's a great connection between them. One of the things that's often discussed is the need for disguise. So for example, I mean, Viola needs to protect herself and she's like, oh, and she chooses to work for Orsino and not for Olivia, which is a choice, but that she needs to because she's in a foreign land. Versus Rosalind, and she plays this whole game with her love with Orlando that she doesn't actually need to play. He's like, yes, I'm in love with Rosalind. She's like, oh, I'm going to continue to do this, right? And so Rosalind has been, several scholars have referred to her as a stage manager, kind of like of theater, and she's coordinating this whole thing that's elongated past the point that it needs to be. And so the question becomes of the choices for disguise, and when Rosalind is, at least from my experience, typically considered to be playing with it more. And that play ends with one of our few epilogues that Shakespeare actually gives us, which directly addresses this actor playing Rosalind, playing a boy, kind of directly on stage. So I think that's actually one of the ways that they connect. But I will say that Viola's statement, I am not what I am, I always teach this play along with Othello because that's Iago's statement as well. And so connecting those two characters and how they're both deceitful versus one in a comedy and one in a tragedy is also a very different kind of connection to make as well.
We're getting another question sort of formulating as we think here, but in the interim, I was wondering a little bit from Trevor about how the twins theme manifests in TikTok videos about this play, because I feel like this theme of disguise and being someone you're not and the delight of doing that is something that can be expressed on TikTok in a way we can't really express it on stage. That's a half-formed question, but do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, can I actually show a short video? Very short, very short. Because that was one of the ones I was going to show. So, you know, there is which one is it? Yeah, here we go. Here we go. Okay, so let's take a look at this real quick.
I've only ever said I love you to two men my entire life. Stone Cold Steve Austin and a guy in a dark club who I mistook for Stone Cold Steve Austin.
So there's this video, right, which uses this.
I've only ever said I love you to
the Stone Cold Steve Austin, right, of being in love with the same person. But on TikTok, basically you show like your husband and then you show a doppelganger of your husband and saying like, these are the only two men I've ever loved. And it's like always the same person. And so here we kind of have that twinning playing. And then in this next one, we have something very similar using another TikTok trend.
Why are you gay? Who says I'm gay? You are gay.
Which takes this popular TikTok sound, and I'm going to stop sharing. I also love that on Zoom we have to narrate everything we're doing, even 2 years in. But in this last one, we have this kind of like saying like, even if you're not gay, you're not bisexual or queer, or whatever it might be, like you are, right? Which is what we kind of do with Twelfth Night. Also keeping in mind that when Twelfth Night was written, 400 plus years ago, Shakespeare wouldn't have had access to like queer or bisexual and those different identity markers, or even been able to stage it in the way that we could do it now. But what these teens are doing and what we're doing here, right, is, but especially queer people, is they're reaching back to the past to create this like lineage, right? To say like, hey, we existed 400 years ago, right? This was happening before, even if it didn't have a name, even if it was something different, or it was masked as cross-dressing or confusion, right? And so those are just two of the different ways that kind of twinning takes place here. There's also a TikToker that does Cesario drag, and it's like all drag, and it's all these TikTok trends and them like in like a Letterman jacket with like the hair and like like it's a woman dressed in drag. It's like a drag king, right? But again, this kind of the idea of the twin is like very common in this kind of subgenre of like digital Shakespeare.
Thank you so much. We have another question from Ella for all the panelists, although I'm going to toss this to David and Melissa first because you'll understand why in a moment. Could you spend some time speaking to the other figures in this play beyond the central Viola, Olivia, Orsino, Sebastian? What about this play's subplots and extended cast of characters interest you, even how their storylines relate to extended discussions of identity and intersectionality? So sort of thinking about intersectionality without thinking about like the main core characters of this play and rather things happening around them.
So I'm not sure if this exactly addresses the question, but you know, thinking about these, David brought up Sir Toby, for instance, earlier, and thinking about, you know, characters like Sir Toby and Malvolio, who are these kind of, you know, ridiculed characters. This is not precisely about intersectionality, though it could be. This is an initial stab to start thinking about the question. It might, what I'm about to say might be much more about hierarchy and social hierarchies, particularly the way that class comes into the play to mark various characters as belonging or not belonging. And so when you get a character like Malvolio, who's, you know, on the one hand, this real kind of Calvinist Puritan character who's ridiculed for that. But on the other, obviously, of a lower class than Olivia. You know, I guess I have Patricia Akimi's work somehow in the back of this, thinking about the ways in which class is marked on the body. And I'm wondering to what extent do those yellow garters manifest some interior inferiority of Malvolio's that naturalizes his class status. But again, I to be honest, I mainly focused on these main characters, and I'd love to hear what David has to say about this.
I'm in a similar boat in terms of focusing on the main characters, but I will say that, you know, all of the characters in their various ways that they're presented are useful for conversations about outsider and insider status and the malleability of that, how one can move from outside to inside or inside to outside. So I don't necessarily isolate characters in that way when I think about plays. You know, I try to give attention to all of them and give them all their due, because even if you're thinking about like the nurse in Titus, who's just there for one scene, she's super important. Even though she gets killed very quickly. And so I think that's one thing. And then as Melissa was saying, you know, and bringing up Patricia Akimi's work, which I think is apt, class is definitely a marked category. And it's also one that is very racialized. But I think to Melissa's point in bringing in Akimi's work, we can also begin to think about conduct, right? Like, how do these characters operate in the plays? What are their limitations? And again, what are the benefits of their statuses as well? And I like to press those points because even though Belch is this, you know, comedic, drunk character, that doesn't mean that he's a throwaway, right? There's value in that particular identity that he has. And I love the way that he, again, it's the character that I'm drawn to, I guess, in terms of the minor characters. So I keep mentioning it, but there's value in that identity and exploring that.
if I could add something about Malvolio, because he desires to move up in class, right? And he's deceived with the letter that Mirai writes, and he thinks it's in Olivia's hand. And so he's deceived through a visual. He misreads, like he misunderstands that. And then he tries to make himself more appealing through a visual, through the yellow stockings, and it's highly comedic. But then he's taken in and he's put in this box, and Sir Topas comes to visit him, which is Festi. And so Festi shifts his vocality and usually uses a different voice, right? To be like, oh, I'm Sir Topas type of thing. And then Malvolio is then confused and taken in by, he's misled by the voice. And so part of the, I don't know if I want to call it the tragedy of Malvolio, although that would be a great alternate title of this play, is that he's deceived in every way. And so he's trying to move up, and he gets it wrong. And he ends, I mean, what happens to him is terrible, right? And there's kind of no solution or resolution for that. And I think that's one of the things that this class desire for class moving, right, shows us. Also, as he's often portrayed as more of a Puritan and kind of meant to symbolize that in the Puritans' dislike of theater. This is what you get if you speak out against the theater. So there you go. Perhaps that's a meta moment from our playwright. But I think that's a good reminder to us about which types of confusion might result in a positive outcome and for whom, and which types of confusion do not. And when you're doubly confused through the visual and the oral that the play shows us, that is the devastating, that is the isolation, right? And so he's one of the minor character who I think about a great deal when it comes to this play.
Thank you. We have one more question and then we're gonna have to wrap up. This one comes from Kaylee Horowitz, who incidentally is my assistant director, so hooray. She's heard many folks talk about how Toby and Mariah's relationship feels like it comes out of nowhere or doesn't make sense in the show. So asks, what are your thoughts on that character pairing and what it does for the story?
I'll begin. I think it shows us, I mean, Mariah is the only one who gets to move up in class of all the pairings, but we only hear about that because she marries off stage. And so if that's acceptable for a gentleman, and as David mentioned, what a gentleman Sir Toby Belch is, right? Not the one you might want around. But so if that's kind of like the aspirational idea that a servant could marry into the gentility, then we don't actually get to see it. And so I think that's a reminder of what type of coupling we get to see on stage and how Viola's silenced after she gets her proposal, and the discomfort that we might have with our couplings. But I think when it comes to staging it, as your assistant director, as you all know, there are many things you can do to make that connection between the characters, if that's the choice. But she helps out. She's the one who comes up with the idea. She does all of this because Toby wants to get revenge, right, on Malvolio. And so she usually is seen as just an enabler, but she's in on it as well. And it's an advantageous marriage for her. So I think that's important because, well, anyway, for all of those reasons, I always like them. And I think that perhaps this is a little bit of a slam. I think they're really quite well suited to each other.
Danielle, well, I don't know if anyone else wants to answer that as well. Danielle, I would like, since we have some time, I would like you to plug your production of Twelfth Night, which is the reason we're here, right?
Okay, so yes, this production of Twelfth Night will be April 21st to the 24th, coincidentally coinciding with Shakespeare's birthday as celebrated. We didn't plan that. At the University of Buffalo, we have a wonderful cast. We have remixed the show with popular music from the 70s, 80s, 90s. So we have dance numbers. I'm a fight director, so we have fights. We have, yes, there is Queen in the show. We have what else do we have? All kinds of crazy things happening. We've got beach balls with glitter inside them. We have a wonderful musician actor who plays Festi and is singing some music live for us. And my cut and adaptation of the show. So if you're local to the area, please join us. It's going to be wonderful. We're very excited about it. And it's all designed by students at the University of Buffalo's theater program. All of our shows are designed by students, so really showcases our students' work. I want to thank all of you for being here today, audience, panelists. This was a really fruitful discussion. I know I have many things to think about. Very exciting. So thank you all, and have a wonderful evening, afternoon. I have to go to rehearsal now, so I'm going to sign off, but I hope we can continue these conversations in other forums as we continue on. Have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, everyone.